So thank you all for coming. Sorry about the little technical issues this morning. I'm not that familiar with Zoom, unfortunately, but you live and learn. So my talk today is It's Dangerous to Design Games, Take This. Basically a list of tips and tricks, things that I have learned over the course of my career. So the last games design conference I gave was very kind of theory heavy. I developed a bunch of ideas around using Kolmogorov complexity, algorithmic information theory, to try and tease out some kind of notion of information complexity or entropy in a game state. And I don't think the people listening found this particularly useful and picked it apart. And I noted at the end of that talk that as an audience member personally, I much prefer it when people with experience in a career that I'm interested in just tell me, okay, here's what I did, here's what worked, here's what didn't work. And I really like Mark Rosewater's talk where he gave 20 lessons, 20 years, 20 lessons. Here's what I've learned. Kind of take it or leave it. So the idea of this talk today is kind of to give you a sort of miscellany of the different things that I've encountered. There's no kind of unified theory to everything. It's very much individual points that I've noted along the way, and hopefully it'll be useful to you. So since we're running a little late, let's jump into it. So it's going to be structured kind of like this, where I'll talk for a bit, give some examples, and then I will share a little tip. So the first tip, obviously, is unified theories are like underpants. We all have our own and don't want to share. Jesse Schell talked about this a little bit as well. We don't have a unified theory of game design that is shared by all game designers. And it's useful, I think, to keep an open mind, to hold your ideas lightly, as Emily Levine would put it, to take inspiration from multiple sources. And so here again, the idea is to have lots of little tidbits that you can take and mix and combine and so on. So a bit of background on me. Oops, sorry, missed a slide there. Oh, there's a slide that doesn't seem to be rendering. Well, that's okay. I should mention I was a programmer before working at Amplitude Studios. I spent a couple of years working first in research and development engineering at a serious game company doing functional and postural rehabilitation, or re-education rather. And then I worked at a company making karaoke games as a gameplay programmer. And before that, I did a bunch of game jams, organized game jams, did various little indie projects, obviously programming my own games. And since working at Amplitude as of 2015, I've been a designer, yes, but my experience in design has been with 4X games, so kind of big, complicated, turn-based strategy games. And as a result, you need to take all this to a certain extent with a pinch of salt. Your mileage is likely to vary a little bit from mine. So everything I say, have that lens when you look at it. So I will mention so that those who haven't stalked me beforehand know. I'm currently lead designer on Humankind, which is Amplitude's next big 4X game, a kind of competitor, we hope, to the Civilization series. So very exciting stuff. And the reason, I must say, for the disorganization this morning, it's nothing to do with the school. It's mainly that we're very, very busy making the game, and I've not looked into the Zoom connection sufficiently in advance. There is one thing that I can probably count on, though, no matter what type of game you're making, no matter the size of the team that you're making it with, you're going to need to eat. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil, you will eat from it all your days. That's biblical. I'm not a particularly religious person, but the unfortunate truth of reality is that man must eat and pay the rent. And if you want to make games, probably pay the electricity bills, pay for hardware, pay for software. And you're going to be answerable to whoever is providing you with these things. If you're a professional, you'll probably have a boss. But even if you're an indie, you'll be answerable to your players. So you won't be entirely independent from the entire universe. This particular photo was taken from PGA, the Poznan Game Arena, where we got a special deal at a game jam for sort of a $330 booth. Normally booths are thousands of euro, if you want to show your game to people for a couple of days. So making the game and then getting the game out there is extremely expensive, even if you're an indie developer. So yeah, I used to want to be an indie, and the term indie, there's a lot of discussion around what does indie even mean. Is it more of an aesthetic these days than a description of kind of financial independence? My view is fairly pragmatic. It's the only true independence is financial. So if you save up for many years and sort of offer yourself a holiday making games, that's great. You work for yourself, but otherwise you're probably going to be working for someone else. So I'm going to be talking a lot about basically interacting with clients, because whether that client is literally an external client or it's a boss or it's a sort of hive mind of players, you're going to be answerable to someone. So I arrived in game design professionally only about 5 years ago, 5.5 now. As I said before, that was a programmer, and I always imagined that game design was mostly, especially as a kid, whose ambition was always to get into game design. I thought it was mostly going to be writing. The game designer writes the game design document. That's how it works, right? So you'd analyze the game, you'd think up new systems, and then you'd write it all down, keep the documentation up to date. And the reality, which is not necessarily a negative thing, is that ultimately these tasks are quite a minor part of the job. The major task that a game designer has to perform is keeping everyone on the same page. So either negotiating, validating iterations with the clients, or making sure that the team are all making the same game and not 12 different games. So a lot of your time and energy, I think, will probably be devoted to running around talking to people. And again, that's no bad thing, but it may not be what you expected necessarily. And again, your mileage may vary. With a small team, you have less communication overhead, but certainly Amplitude is not one of the biggest teams in the games industry, and communication is one of our primary say time sinks, but that's a kind of negative way of putting it. One of the primary uses of our time at Amplitude. So yeah, bear in mind, documentation is just a means to an end. The true goal ultimately is communication. We're not just looking to write the perfect document. I was thinking of quoting Plato from Phaedrus here, but I think I'll probably skip over that because we started a little bit late. And I think to some of you these tips may seem obvious, and if they do, great. It means that you've already integrated some of these ideas. And things that seem obvious once you've learnt them may not be before you have. I hope you'll bear with me because there are some things that go a little bit further later on. But if all this seems clear to you, then great. Now I would mention while I'm at it. Have we skipped a slide? Oh yes, sorry. you'll notice between these two slides that I used the same color and a common pictogram to denote the slices of pie, so that you wouldn't get lost between them. This is just something to note in passing. I use this site gameicons.com very liberally. Everything on it is Creative Commons. You need to what's the word? Cite the people whose work you've used somewhere, but other than that, you're free to use them, and it's extremely useful as a source of vectorial pictograms. And actually, a friend of mine runs it, so yeah, there you go. Well, an acquaintance. So yeah, Game Icons is your friend, and I would say, in your documentation, in your presentations, establishing a consistent pictographic language is a really helpful way of getting your ideas to stick. The brain kind of scans over a slide or scans over a document and sees patches of colors and sees images first of all, and then the words come in later. In a way, the images kind of, I find, create an anchor. So they create a reminder. Often when you're pitching to someone, if you're pitching to, say, whatchamacallit, a publisher, they'll have seen X pictures, they may be tired, they may have seen, a million trillion things. So if your slide is just a wall of text, they're likely to lose interest and gloss over it. Whereas if you have these kind of anchors to bring the focus back in and to create a sort of visual continuity between different slides, it can really help. I've found. And by the same token, thinking up clear, evocative, distinct names for things is very important. As a programmer, I spent an inordinate amount of time coming up with names for my variables, and it's not time wasted. As a game designer as well, it's very important to think of what these concepts are called. And if you can't think of a name for a concept for an intermediate calculation variable in your game that the player needs to be aware of and needs to be able to see, if you can't name that, it's probably a bad sign. It's probably a sign that there's too much kind of obscure mathematics going on. It's also interesting, you might think that finding distinct names for things is easy, but this schematic, by the way, is from Diplomacy and Humankind, and those are some of the terms. We have things like morale and grievances, but then when you bring the AI into the equation, you also have things like animosity, attitude, behavior, nemesis, all these other concepts that often kind of collide, and so you really have to be careful about what you mean by a given thing, because people will take that name and they will run with it. And for instance, the word animosity might originally have been a measure of a military strength, but because you've called it animosity, people start taking other factors into account, because they say, oh well, it's animosity, it's aggression, it should take these other things into account. So the names you give things are very important. And as a designer, you may be laying the foundations for years of live production on a game. So yeah, words are stones. I think that was Carlo Levi who said that. The ones you choose for your game concepts will ground them. They'll also potentially drag you down. So yeah, you have to be very careful with the words you choose. So continuing on game design documents, I've talked about communication being the primary goal behind documentation. So I want to give some examples of the sort of documentation we use at Amplitude. We've got today, we use Confluence. Before, we used a lot of Microsoft Word. We used a lot of PowerPoint. We have things written up on a whiteboard, or we did back when we were able to all come into the studio. Hopefully we'll be able to all come back in soon. We have, Excel spreadsheets either to track, track metrics or also to perform simulations. So these are all from Endless Legend. I don't feel it's problematic to be sharing them since they're years and years old. But you can see that, the format is very different between two different documents. And the reason for that is simple. It's, if the goal is communication, not documentation, then the right document is, going to be defined by the person you're talking to. Different people need different things. Different people perceive the world differently. If you take the audience into consideration when creating a document, you will not create the same document depending on whether you're talking to your lead programmer or your lead artist or whatever. If you get to know these people, you get to know what their biases are, what their preferences are, and you can communicate more effectively. So yeah, again, probably you've moved past this at this point, but there is an obsession, I think, among young kids who want to get into game design of what is the right way to write a game design document. What is the game design document format? And in my view, in any case, there is no right game design document format. The format is whatever best gets the message across. So it's going to depend on you. It's going to depend on your game. It's going to depend on your team. And we've done great big, one-page posters as well, which are great. All kinds of things. It really depends on what we need. And some of our documents are even interactive. So, for humankind, we prototype the economy with like a board game prototype. We prototype the, in humankind, you build your civilization by kind of layering cultures on top of each other rather than choosing one at the beginning of the game and following through with it till the end. So, you'll be Egyptians and then you'll be Romans and then you'll be, say the Franks, for instance. And that was prototyped also, using a paper prototype, so using a sort of board game, which, not only helped us to better define the way the mechanics were going to work, but it also helped us onboard new team members as they came into the team. So, so it wasn't just, a prototype answers a question, right? You're not sure how something is going to work, so you prototype it. It can also serve as documentation. The tactical battles in humankind were prototyped as well using basically a little HTML5 game that I wrote, and that for a long time as well, served as the primary documentation for the battles. We would refer to it and say, oh, okay, well, in the prototype it worked like this, and other things like the propagation of culture and religion across the map were prototyped as well using an HTML5 or did Unity prototypes as well for AI. So prototypes are great. All the usual tips. You want to know what question you're answering. You don't want to just build a simpler version of the game. You want it to be very focused on getting you the information you need. Does this work? Does this not work? Forget all the rest. In my experience, the systems that we've prototyped have been much more quickly, much better than those that we haven't been able to prototype. On that point, diplomacy, for instance, I before becoming lead on humankind, so I'm currently the lead designer. I was a senior designer on the project working on the military and the diplomacy. And as I said, the tactical battles I prototyped. Diplomacy I never prototyped. I stuck to kind of a more theoretical approach where I spent a very long time arguing, with myself and with my bosses, what the right way to do things was from a theoretical point of view, using flowcharts and using arguments, and ultimately the diplomacy we've had to retake multiple times. So I think if I had managed to find some way of prototyping it, we would have had something a lot stronger than simply kind of I guess, theoretical debate. So yeah, better to prove your ideas with a prototype than with a bunch of theory. Before Amplitude, of course, I never really had to prove anything. I was just I was working professionally as a programmer. I occasionally did some freelance design, but mostly I was just making my own stuff in my own time when it came to designs. And that can give you a kind of strong bias that you might not realize you have, which is that you think a lot about what you're doing and you think a lot about how you're getting it done, but you don't need to think a lot about why. Why do I want this? That degree of introspection may not be necessary if you're just working for yourself. You can be kind of a cool indie artist, and make your own stuff and let the muse express itself through you and not really wonder why. And that can be a problem once you start working with a larger team, because people are going to ask you, well, why? Okay, you want to do all this stuff, you've laid out your system that you want to put together, but why should we invest all this money? Why should we invest all this time to create this system? And if you're not used to that introspection, you may not be able to answer. And worse, you may say to yourself, well, because it's objectively the right thing to do, because my rationality, my education as a game designer tells me that by A plus B equals C, logically this will work. And that's a trap. Obviously there is theory, and I'm not going to rail against theory, entirely, but you always need to hold your ideas lightly again, and always question, and always, go after, the root cause of why you're trying to push in a certain direction, because generally speaking, the foundation of any direction will be some kind of emotional element. You want something because, one day you ate a pineapple, and since then you've always thought that pineapples are great, so you want to put a pineapple in the game, and your mind will trick you. Your mind, is very good at post-rationalizing on top of decisions that your heart has already made. There are various studies that have shown that that we do this a lot without realizing. We post-rationalize. So accept that you're biased. You might think to yourself, I'm surrounded by fools. They're all none of them are logical. I'm the only logical person here. Or maybe you're past that, but I, in any case, was very much in that state of mind. And you are biased. Get familiar with those biases, so you can move past them, and so you can explain yourself. So I'm going to try and move on a bit more quickly, because I note that if we want to have time for questions, we're going to need to accelerate. So apologies if I pass through these rapidly. Yeah, so my first ever game, which is the one up the top here, a little platformer game, I didn't want to have what's called in platformer games, air control. So you would jump and you would have momentum and you would keep traveling in that direction. All the players it was the Game Maker forums at the time, were constantly requesting air control, and I was saying, no, that's unrealistic, because when you jump, you can't control yourself in the air. And I actually added a little arm flapping animation when you tried to move in the opposite direction to the one you were traveling. And to me, that denotes a real lack of empathy. You need to accept that you're not objective, that other people have opinions that can be valuable, that as the creator of the game, you've spent so much time with it, you're not objective. You might have gotten used to mechanics that are really kind of weird, and if you're not able to develop the necessary empathy to put yourself in the player's shoes, then you're only going to be able to make games for yourself, which is a bit of a problem. This game down the bottom here is a game I made called Just Be Yourself, which is me railing against how hard dating is. And yeah, I mean, that game was just made for me. You know, it's an audience of one to vent my frustration, and that's all very well if you want to be an artist, but you know, don't quit your day job. So yeah, and here I use the term client, but you know, you can replace that with player, you know, depending on your situation. Communication, you might think it's about saying stuff, but it's actually a big part of it is about listening. You know, you're going to have trouble communicating effectively with someone, and you're going to need to communicate effectively with a client if you don't understand what makes them tick. You know, so listen to this person, you know, build some kind of rapport, you know, ask them, you know, how the day's going, you know, kind of to make sure that you're not going to walk on a landmine as well, because, you know, if someone is having a very bad day, you know, they may not want to say yes to something, whereas the next day they might, you know. So yeah, and figure out what makes this person tick, speak their language, you know. Pick the opportune moment. It may be hard to accept this, but sometimes context is as important as content when you're pitching something. I've said this before about, you know, the format of documentation. You know, documentation should be adapted towards the person that it's being presented to, and live documentation. So, you know, a pitch that is presented. You know, I mean, I've not been able to check in much with you because you know, there are 144 of you, so it's a little bit difficult to go around the table, so to speak. You know, but usually I would check in with people and see, you know, how people are going, whether people are following. So yeah, you know, context is as important as content. The context of this particular presentation is I arrived late, so everyone is kind of stressed out. You know, and often, you know, it's not about you. It's often. It's not about you. It's not about your presentation. You know, a lot of the time, the other person is not in the right state of mind, and you need to pick up on that. You know, so take the temperature, address the elephant in the room. You know, if you feel like the person is wants to talk about a different subject, has a different thing that they're worried about, talk about that instead. Don't waste your time trying to force them to engage with something if they're not in the right headspace. You know. And, you know, I'm not going to read this out entirely. Tim Minchin is a great comedian, said a lot of great things. This was in a commencement speech, but he talks about, you know, a lot of the time, you know, arguments are pointless because we're effectively, you know, it's like we're tennis players hitting beautiful shots, but from the opposite end of different tennis courts. You know, both people are being perfectly logical and sensible, but the basis is not the same. So the argument is pointless. So really, and this is very important, you know, you need to start by agreeing on null hypotheses. You know what these are in mathematics. They're the base kind of assumptions, you know, and you build up from there. So you know, introspection, figure out what makes you tick. Empathy, figure out what makes your client tick. Try and find some middle ground between those two things and agree on that. And then when you have agreed on that, when you have agreed on, you know, emotionally speaking, you know, what are we going for? You know, check in regularly. You know, is this okay? Does this fit with what we want to do? You know, give people a chance to say, oh, actually, you know, either to change their mind, to iterate, or to clarify what they had in mind. And this step is actually very long and hard, you know, because it's kind of like, you know, psychoanalysis, sorry. You know, you're kind of putting this person on the couch and trying to draw things out of their brain, so to speak, and your own brain as well, you know, so easier said than done. And, you know, obviously empathy, you know, I've talked about clients, you know, publishers, people you're pitching to. Empathy is important for players too. You know, it's trite, but can't be said enough. You know, different players want different things. And these things will change over time. You know, a beginner will arrive and they'll need things to be, simple enough to engage with. They'll not engage with every mechanic. A speed runner will engage with mechanic. Sorry, my microphone just turned itself off there. Speedrunners will engage with mechanics or bugs that you never intended them to be engaging with. So different players will interact with different things, and effectively that means that the game is a different game for them. Because they're not following the same rules. They're not interested in following the same rules. So effectively you're designing like a zoo, with different habitats for the different animals. Granted, probably shouldn't treat players like animals, but you see what I mean, and I like the example of Disney World a lot. There's this famous anecdote about Walt Disney, checking all the sight lines and squatting down to the height of a child so that he could see the world through a child's eyes. And as some more concrete examples from our games, Endless Legend, Endless Space 2, we have a turn-based strategy game. So some people want to play it very competitively with a random number generator that makes everything fair. And some people engage with the backstory, with the lore. They aren't interested in competition. They aren't interested in playing multiplayer. Oops, sorry. Just checking the chat there to see if there was anyone saying I can't hear you. These two groups are very much at odds, and there are different groups as well. So people want to be able to turn off the quests, turn off the random events, and other people, that's what they're here for. You're never designing just one game. Your audience is not a monolith, and also, your audience changes over time. Now, it can be hard sometimes. I've talked about these different types of players. Some of them are easier to listen to than others. We finally got our Endless Legend is Broken YouTube video. When you see something like this posted, your ego will flare up most likely, and you'll say to yourself, "Oh no, I have to fix this. My game can't possibly be broken." But you have to realize as well that even if there are exploits in your game, it's kind of like DRM. If the DRM ends up primarily punishing your paying customers, if it punishes the honest people in order to prevent a few dishonest people from pirating, then you're kind of losing, and everyone is losing. So you have to take, again, these kind of feedback, these kind of problems lightly. You might want to say to people, yes, we fixed all the exploits, but that focusing on that may not be the best way of making your game actually fun. This is something that was brought home to me quite recently, because I had that problem with ego. But an overly defensive design, so that's a design with a whole bunch of rules that are placed in to restrict, to prevent all these little exploits that speedrunners might use, can be worse than one that allows for the old exploit. There was this interesting analysis I saw a while ago on Baldur's Gate 2 versus Pillars of Eternity, saying that Baldur's Gate 2 had all this content that was completely off the rocker, that would completely explode all the balancing and would allow you to kill the final boss in one hit. But there was a kind of color and personality to this, and you have to question whether it's entirely a bad thing to leave that stuff in, if it gives the game a kind of character. And also looking at systems in general, you might look into something and say, oh, this is not accurately modeling reality. This is far too, this is lacking in elegance. I remember a chap presenting an alternative to basically most pen and paper role-playing games have some kind of mechanism for determining success for any given challenge. So you'll compare a skill to a difficulty, and that will give you a percent chance of success. And this chap was saying, well, what we want is some kind of, asymptotic curve where, if you're above a certain value, you have a diminishing return on investment. So, the more you increase your skill, the more you approach an 100% chance, but you never, get all the way perfectly to that 100% chance. Whereas something like Dungeons and Dragons, you increase your skill level by 1 and it adds exactly 5%. And then at some point, you saturate at 100%, and that's that, and you might think, well, that doesn't, that lacks smoothness. It's a very simple formula. It's very boring. But, you have to look at this from the player's perspective. It's a lot easier to grok a kind of plus 5% per extra point of skill in something than, plus some kind of percent, depending on where you are on that curve. And I did something similar for the damage calculations in humankind, where originally I had quite a complicated formula where you'd have the attacker's strength and the defender's strength, and based on a comparison between the two, it would calculate damage. But we've ended up going with something quite simple, simply because we want players to be able to intellectualize that damage calculation. So yeah, don't let your ego trick you into going after something that's complicated, or that seems to model reality, or that would impress your game designer friends. Think about the player. So yeah, beautiful, elegant systems aren't necessarily fun to interact with. I've talked about systems a little bit. It can be helpful to really step back entirely from the systems and the mechanics and consider the player. Where are they? What are they doing? These two games on the left here, there's Doom and there's Doom 64. One of them is played on the sofa with a gamepad, and one of them is played with a keyboard without a mouse. And when you look at something like Z Doom, you're using a mouse, so your body posture is different. You don't have your hands in front on the keyboard like this anymore. You have one hand holding a mouse, which is very uncomfortable, whereas a gamepad is even more comfortable. And this really participates in the overall aesthetic of the game. So don't get lost in the system. Really, take a step back and try and occupy that physical and emotional space. Again, empathy. This was really brought home to me at a game jam where we made this very simple, from a system point of view, little game. But that the goal was essentially you would have an opponent, and you'd have to summon a demon to counter that opponent. But the way that you made your choices was you had this grimoire of spells, and you would draw symbols on a chalkboard. Initially we'd hoped to have a webcam that would detect which symbol you drew. Ultimately, it was me hiding in a box, pressing buttons when people drew things. But it was in a dark room, and kind of underground with all these little candles, and it worked really well from the setting. So set and setting, very important, and often forgotten. Play happens in the mind, not in the hands, not in the screen. So take a step back. Accepting this kind of blurs the line between art and rules. A lot of people who subscribe to Tetrism, believe in the purity of rules. Art is just a coat of paint on top. I'm not going to go into this, but I would heartily recommend reading Brian Upton's Aesthetic of Play, or watching his talk, The Play of Stillness. But I'll just give you this example. So this is a game I made where I very much did say to the artist, "Oh, just let your imagination go wild, draw whatever." And we ended up with this game where you have a flying octopus laying eggs that eat grass to get bigger, and then you can turn the eggs into lanterns or fountains or statues or bombs. That's a really hard sell, So art is important, I think if we'd had different art, the game would have been a lot easier to get your head around, and would have meant something. So again, I won't go into exactly how this game works, but it's pretty awesome, and even if it is full of eggs that eat grass, I still strongly believe in its quality. So yeah, you know, don't be that person who is just focused on you know, mechanics. You know, your job is to design a game experience. Lore, art, music, sound, they're all just as important as mechanics, you know. So yeah, as I said, you know, and as Brian Upton explains a lot better than I could, you know, all of this is content. It's just brain food, you know, and not all content has an equal nutritional value. And here I'm getting into the talk I referenced at the beginning of the presentation on, you know, algorithmic information theory. I'm not going to go into it because we don't necessarily have time, but you'll acknowledge that, you know, 18 billion unique explorable planets, or 17 million weapons in Borderlands, you know, just because your random generator can churn out a bunch of content, it doesn't mean that content is meaningfully distinct, you know. And so, you know, I would invite you to look into notions of algorithmic information theory, you know, of complexity, of compressibility, because these things I feel apply very much to content, to random generation. What I will say is, as a takeaway, is that content that doesn't require new thought, you know, as Upton would say, new analytical play, doesn't add anything, you know. In computer science lingo, you'd say it's all data, but, you know, very limited entropy, very limited data complexity, you know. And if you want to add this so-called entropy, my advice would be to look for places in your game where players have a go-to strategy, where they always do something. Try and turn that into a sometimes. So for instance, in Endless Legend, as you can see in the top left, you know, players would tend to follow patterns when building their cities. They would always follow exactly the same pattern to optimize the productivity of their cities. So in Shifters, you know, we threw them a bit of a curveball by adding in these special city extensions that would need to be placed on a specific area, you know, in order to get the full yield. And that meant that you were kind of drawn away from these patterns towards something that would kind of snake out towards a specific tile. So that kind of turned an always follow this pattern into a sometimes follow this pattern, but you'll also want to take this into account, which made the, you know, which injected a little bit more play into the equation. So not all content was created equal. You want to add things that call player strategies into question. You know, obviously, there's a difference between questioning and invalidating. You know, here I'm using a movie reference because, again, you know, I'm a big fan of Upton, and to Upton, there is essentially no difference between watching a film and playing a game. You know, the mind is interacting with both and performing interpretative play on both. You know, you don't want to be destroying the mental models that players have worked so hard to build. You know, people want to iterate, sure, they want to improve their models, but they don't necessarily want to throw everything out. So yeah, change an always into a sometimes, but don't change it into a never. And we've fallen into this trap a couple of times in iterations that we've made. So yeah, bear in mind the hours players have spent theory crafting. You know, loss aversion is a powerful psychological phenomenon. You know, people don't want to lose their work. So yeah, be mindful of that. So look, I'm sorry I kind of sped up at the end there. And we don't have an awful lot of time for questions, which is tip number 20. If you go over time, no one will have time to ask you any. But we have perhaps a couple of minutes, Remy, for some questions. So so I will pass it back to you. And there is a slide here with the list of all of the tips if you want to take a screen capture of that. Yeah, so thank you very much.